Your Eminence, fathers, brothers, and sisters in Christ, glory to Jesus Christ. Glory. And a greeting to all of you who are joining this evening by live stream. We welcome you to the 2020 Founders Lecture, held close to Founders Day here at St. Tikhon's and the feast of St. Tikhon of Moscow, the patron of our beloved Metropolitan. We welcome especially this evening Father John Cox, who is the pastor of Holy Door Mission Orthodox Church in Norfolk, Virginia, where he has served for nearly a decade. He is, together with our St. Tikhon's alumnus, Father Joseph Lucas, the managing editor of the digital journal Rule of Faith, which you can find at ruleoffaith.org. Tonight, our live stream and our lecture were made possible by a generous grant from the Elsie Skvir Ganister Foundation. We thank you for this generous opportunity to share this lecture this evening with the wider world. We welcome you, Father John, to the podium and look forward to your lecture, Mind the Gap, First Principles and Popular Theology. Father John.
Your Eminence, Reverend Fathers, esteemed seminarians, brothers and sisters in Christ, it is my pleasure to be here with you this evening and to have the honor of addressing you at this Founders Lecture. I must warn you in advance that I tend not to wander a lot. And so there's a very good chance that if you blink, you'll miss it. So there is also here, you will notice, an encouragement that this lecture will probably not go on as long as someone else might. I happen to know that Father John Parker, the dean of this institution, loves ice cream. And so I thought I would introduce the theme right here at the beginning with ice cream. Did you ever eat an ice cream sundae? You know, the kind that has scoops of ice cream piled up, and then there's whipped cream on top of that, and then a cherry on top of that. Imagine that someone came along as you are just about to eat your ice cream sundae, and they flick the cherry right off the top of your sundae. You might contemplate some less than hospitable thoughts toward this person, but if they began then to declare very proudly and excitedly that they had successfully destroyed your sundae, you might conclude that they were in fact insane. Much perhaps of what we consider theological discourse that takes place on the internet, what I am calling tonight the popular level, is like this. I don't mean that it's always ill and ugly, though it often is. I mean that what gets all the attention, what usually happens at the whipped cream and cherry level, and rarely goes much deeper than that. This evening, I want to describe 3 aspects of a problem related to the way we create and participate in theological discourse in the 21st century. And then I want to offer a model drawing on the scholarship of Father Matthew Baker and Father George Florovsky of discourse that I think will be more fruitful, especially as we move more deeply into the reality of a post-Christian world. I'd like to begin with a sort of case study that might help to put flesh on the bones of the first part of the problem I'm trying to describe. In the late 18th century, Edward Gibbon published a 6-volume history of the Roman Empire, covering hundreds of years, using thousands of primary and secondary sources in which he purports to describe the descent from noble antiquity into the, quote, rubbish of the Dark Ages, end quote. Now, this grand and complex historical narrative in which Christianity is at least largely responsible for the decline of the Western world gets passed down through other thinkers, in other books, in other genres, through the theology of Harnack, the novels of Arthur Conan Doyle, specifically The White Company, which was very popular up until World War II, all the way down to 2020 and this guy on Twitter. As you can see, we have descended from a grand narrative to a cliche. Like a game of telephone, something of the original idea with which Gibbon began has made it successfully around the circle, but a lot has got lost on the way. But what made it possible for the concept of the Dark Ages to retain some force of meaning, even though it got thinner and thinner as it moved through time, is that it simply diffused into the cultural fabric, the intellectual background of the modern world. It became one of those things that everyone was sure had been proved and everyone knows is true, but in a rather vague sort of way. To some extent, this kind of thing is inevitable. Whether or not they are true, ideas that gain sufficient ascendancy are simplified, reframed to be more accessible to a broader audience, and gradually absorbed into the general consciousness of a culture until they become like Paisleys in the wallpaper. But between the adjective-laden screed of your garden variety keyboard warrior and the concept of Dark Ages developed by Gibbon, there is an ocean. Now, this is the first part of our problem. As they get simplified or move through time, ideas become increasingly untethered from their sources, even if they get absorbed into the intellectual background of the culture. In this process, they lose nuance and context. Sometimes they acquire new shades of meaning. Occasionally, they actually acquire an opposite meaning. Recent events demonstrate that such shifts can be far from trivial. In January 2019, the ecumenical patriarch wrote to Archbishop Anastasios of Albania justifying the reception of schismatic Ukrainian clergy into the Orthodox Church by fiat, that is, merely by the stroke of a pen, without the laying on of hands or even repentance. In this letter, His All Holiness uses the Meletian schism addressed by the First Ecumenical Council as a precedent for his own actions. But contrary to the Patriarch's assertion, the First Ecumenical Council did, in fact, call for the reordination of schismatic Meletian clergy. How is it that His All Holiness got this backward? The answer is in his use of sources. Rather than drawing on the primary sources relevant to the Meletian schism, the Ecumenical Patriarch, or his ghostwriter, drew on the appendix to a 19th century pamphlet published by then Metropolitan Basil of Ankylos, which in turn depends in large part on the textual argument of a philological work published by the Calvinist Johann Caspar Switzer in Amsterdam in the 17th century. Both of these sources make a hash of the primary source material, which accounts for the mistake. Now, secondary sources are not always so badly mistaken, but this illustrates how serious the ramifications of this untethering from primary sources can be. An entire schismatic group was restored to the church, and at least a significant part of the basis for doing so was established by means of mistaken and inadequate sourcing. For Orthodox Christians who privilege tradition not just as a noun, but as a verb, the act of handing down the deposit of faith from one generation to the next, the connection between our theological convictions and their sources must be preserved and even strengthened when necessary. Such attention will help us to avoid rather vast errors, like the one I just described, but also the tendency to exalt mere custom to the vaults of eternal truth. On the local level, this is perhaps the greater problem. I will never forget a discussion I observed in an online clergy group where it came up somehow that clergy in the OCA take 3 sips from the chalice at clergy communion, and those in the GOA only take 1. Well, there was a great deal of indignation and huffing and puffing about this on all sides, everybody accusing everyone else of innovation and change, searching dramatically for historical evidence to bulwark their position, and generally just being stuffy. The argument, however, gradually lost momentum as it became apparent that neither side could claim that liturgical history was entirely on their side, but I digress. The untethering of ideas from their sources and their subsequent misuse or misunderstanding leads directly to the second part of the problem I'm trying to describe for you this evening. The internet exacerbates this tendency because it is a space in which ideas are almost by definition simplified and unmoored from their anchorages. As I mentioned in the flyer advertising this talk, the five-page synopsis of the 500-page book that you read on your favorite site usually only describes the author's argument, focusing instead on the conclusions, the cherry on top of the sundae, if you will. The obvious consequence of this is that the casual reader has the impression that an argument has been made far more often than it actually has. A great example of this is an article on the concept of nature written by Reverend Dr. Vasilios Thermos and posted at Public Orthodoxy last year. In the article, Father Vasilios sets out to advance a concept of nature based on the theology of Maximus the Confessor. He contrasts his approach with that of Thomas Aquinas and asserts that most Orthodox who make use of the, quote, nature argument, end quote, as he calls it, are indebted to Aquinas rather than Orthodox sources, which prevents them from adopting a more authentic and constructive opinion vis-a-vis homosexual relations and gender dysphoria. And I'd like to look more closely at his argument as an illustration of the point I'm trying to make. Father Vasilios begins by giving an example of the nature argument in the form of an article, of a link to an article by Dr. David Bradshaw, which was also published by Public Orthodoxy as part of the same series as Father Vasilios' article. In this article, Dr. Bradshaw defends the importance of nature as a theological category and offers a very basic definition of what is meant by the expressions according to or contrary to nature. As yet, in Dr. Thermos' article, we don't have a very clear picture of what the nature argument is beyond that it includes the idea of something being according to or contrary to nature. Before offering a more complete definition, Father Vasilios assures us that the nature argument comes from outside the church and is often deployed to justify malicious behavior. Having set the stage in this way, Father Vasilios gives us a fuller definition of the nature argument. As you can see, the nature argument is part of something called natural law theory. Well, let me see if I can find that. Well, I can't find that one. Yeah, there it is. As you can see, the nature argument is part of something called natural law theory, invented by Thomas Aquinas. In this theory, nature is defined in scholastic terms, which we are told means that nature has a set of fixed forms or essences, the presence of which requires an essentialist metaphysics. Having laid this all out, Father Vasilios concludes this portion of his essay by saying that contemporary moral objections to phenomena like homosexuality are often relied on what we call the nature argument, and this is unnatural. Orthodox theology appears largely unaware that when it has recourse to the nature argument, it is playing the part of the loyal Thomist. Now, I'm sure that most of you have already noticed that two things are missing in Father Vasilios' argument. First, he never defines the concepts that he says the nature arguments are built on. If you want to know what natural law theory, forms or essences, or essentialism are, you'll have to look elsewhere. The second missing piece of the argument flows from this. Without some understanding of what those things are and how they work, it is impossible to tell whether Orthodox theologians use those same concepts and indeed use them in the same way. All we're given by way of proof that Orthodox and scholastic Catholic nature arguments are identical is the shared use, exemplified in Dr. Bradshaw's article, of the expressions according to and contrary to nature. If this is all that is necessary to establish the absolute parity of nature arguments, I would like to propose that the Stoic philosopher Seneca is actually our intellectual father. Whether you believe Father Vasilios is correct that Orthodox nature arguments are identical to Thomistic ones, my point is that he hasn't actually supported his claim. On the question of nature arguments, he only appears to have made a case. The second half of Father Vasilios' article develops his alternative understanding of nature. One, he says, is rooted in the theology of St. Maximus the Confessor. In 2 short paragraphs, he tells us that for St. Maximus, nature is dynamic and eschatological, free from pre-existing forms or inherent structural teleology. He tells us this without once quoting or even citing any of the writings of St. Maximus, or, for that matter, any other source. The strength of his characterization of St. Maximus' theology depends entirely on your willingness to trust him. I am not suggesting any attempt at subterfuge on the part of Father Vasilios. I take it for granted that he is presenting what he genuinely believes to be St. Maximus' thought on the matter. But an argument that claims a historical source said X that does not show you how and where the source says it, or include primary or secondary citations, is simply an appeal to authority. Once again, nothing in Father Vasilios' argument has actually been demonstrated to his readers. Perhaps one might suggest, not all kinds of articles are intended to prove something. Sometimes maybe a theologian wants to simply sketch out a different way of thinking about a problem without all the bother of developing it thoroughly. At the end of the article, Father Vasilios himself suggests that his thoughts have the character of a provisional sketch, even as he urges his readers once more to embrace his understanding of St. Maximus. But they aren't interpreted as a provisional sketch by Dr. Aristotle Papanikolaou. In a pair of articles published on the same theme and shortly after the one by Father Vasilios, and in the same series, Dr. Papanikolaou puts forward a theological approach to questions of sex that would, in theory, open the door to blessing same-sex marriages in the Orthodox Church. In his second essay, he briefly addresses the problem, the implied problem of how to reconcile his approach with the kinds of nature arguments Father Vasilios mentioned in his essay. His solution is elegant in its simplicity. He offloads the entire question onto the 2 articles by Bradshaw and Thermos that we just reviewed. In other words, Dr. Papanikolaou links to Bradshaw's article in acknowledgement that nature is a relevant category of concern, and then he links to Father Vasilios' explanation of St. Maximus, which, remember, contains not one actual phrase from St. Maximus, as a sufficient answer to that concern. To all appearances, an argument has been made, but as we see, this is simply an illusion. If you're following along at home, what we have done so far is to describe 2 aspects of the problem of the gap between us and our sources in contemporary theological dialogue as we do it online. The first problem was that as ideas get simplified or move through time, they tend to come untethered from their sources, which often leads to those ideas being wrongly interpreted and applied. Following from that, the second part of the problem was that the internet, almost by definition, reduces everything to smaller and simpler parts. The building blocks of theological argument that conclusions are supposed to be built on are usually only described or briefly summarized in order to get onto the conclusions, which, of course, is where all the excitement is, and where one can most potently react to the news of the day. On account of this, we often mistake the description of an argument for its actual demonstration, and thereby acquire the impression that much more has been proved than a careful reading can sustain. The third part of the problem I would like to describe before turning to Fathers Matthew Baker and George Florovsky for guidance follows closely from the first two, and I imagine it has already occurred to you. If the theological discourse we engage in online tends to be fragmented and focused on conclusions to the detriment of building sound arguments, we are wasting enormous amounts of time and energy discussing, debating, and creating and rebutting content that has no lasting value. Now, far be it from me to suggest that anyone not waste time on the internet. By all means, meme away. But what I want to call attention to is specifically the cheapening of the task and discipline of theology that develops when we participate in it unseriously. In his first theological oration, St. Gregory the theologian reminds us that discussion of theology is not for everyone. Not for everyone, I tell you. It is no such inexpensive or effortless pursuit, nor, I would add, is it for every occasion or for every audience. I call your attention especially to the words inexpensive and effortless. I think we need to take this more to heart than we usually do. If we are doing it properly, the task of theology is difficult and costly. How so? Some are inclined to interpret these adjectives in an exclusively ascetic or mystical sense. That is, theology is difficult and costly in that it requires a difficult ascetic struggle in order to purify the heart and arrive at the inner experience of God. Those of a more academic bent might prefer to emphasize the hard work of the mind required to comprehend the deeper nuances and insights and implications of doctrine. Neither has an exclusive claim on the truth here. Whether in books, groups, or on the internet, theology, no matter how complex, is always oriented, according to St. Irenaeus in his book on the apostolic preaching, always oriented toward the revelation of the true God and the confession of the true faith. How does that relate to what we are discussing? Allow me to explain by appearing to wander even further afield. In his exact exposition of the faith, St. John of Damascus highlights the tripartite nature of the human soul. And this follows on, of course, from Gregory of Nyssa and goes all the way back to Plato. The reasoning part of the soul, according to St. John, what is usually called the nous or the heart or the intellectual soul, is the throne of God in the human person and guides the powers of will and desire that belong to the lower or unreasoning soul. I like the word intellect especially here because it provides a very clear description of what the higher soul does. To intellect is to apprehend, to grasp, to take hold, to draw in something. So for the baptized Christian, the intellectual soul takes a hold of God, who makes his home within, and by means of the illuminating grace of his presence, governs the lower soul, the powers of will and desire, as well as the body, which St. Maximus tells us in his seventh ambiguum, enables the body also to participate in immortality. St. Maximus' understanding given here has an eschatological frame that points to the fulfillment of the human vocation, given first in paradise and in the book of Genesis, to be Lord over the creation, and the means by which each thing participates in God. Out of God's great goodness, human beings were composed of a soul and body. The rational and intellectual soul given to man is made in the image of its maker, and through desire and intense love holds fast to God and participates in the divine life. The soul becomes godlike through divinization, and because God cares for what is lower, that is the body, has given the command to love one's neighbor. The soul prudently makes use of the body. By practicing the virtues, the body gains familiarity with God and becomes a fellow servant of the soul. God, who dwells in the soul, uses it as an instrument to relate to the body, and through the intimate bond between body and soul makes it possible for the body to share in the gift of immortality. This, to be Lord over creation, involves the experiential indwelling of grace as well as the rightly ordered mind that enables the naming of the animals to draw together the eschatological with the protological. In other words, patristic anthropology affirms that the task of theology is an integrated task of the whole person. It should not be reduced to a matter of pure mind or pure experience, nor to a passive regurgitation of quotations, formula, or liturgical texts. The Chalcedonian definition safeguards the absolute necessity of holding together what is within history and therefore subject to rational inquiry with what is beyond history and therefore beyond our ability to speak of. This holistic approach must not only inform our understanding of theology, but our understanding of how we go about the theological task. In what we've covered so far, I have tried to describe some problematic aspects of the challenge of participating in theological discourse online. Ideas get separated from their sources and often get misused and misunderstood. Because of the reductive nature of internet content, we often think arguments have been made when they have only been described. And a consequence of this is that the task of theology is often conducted in a manner that is inconsistent with its value and the character of the Christian vocation. Someone listening just this far might conclude, with some justification, that the best response to what I have said is simply not to do theology online. This is, in my opinion, far too low an estimation of our capabilities. We must do much better. In the time that remains, I would like to propose a way of going about theology that I hope will be more fruitful and more faithful. As the title of my talk indicates, the solution I'm offering for the problems of theology on the internet involves a return to first principles. This can be taken in any number of ways, and so I want to clarify what I'm thinking of. For a Christian, the first principle of theology is the Holy Scriptures. This is clearly demonstrated for us in the story of Luke and Cleopas meeting Jesus on the road to Emmaus in the 24th chapter of Luke, with which you're all so familiar. As they're walking along, Jesus opens the Scriptures and shows how they all speak about him, about his death and resurrection. And it says their hearts burn within them. And this is their preparation for seeing him in the breaking of the bread. The revelation of God in Christ in the breaking of the bread is preceded by the proclamation of Christ in the Holy Scriptures. This is the foundation on which the theophany of God's revelation is built. The proclamation of the crucified and risen Lord Jesus is a scriptural one, absolutely. In his article, Theology, Reasons, and History, which develops certain themes in the work of Father George Florovsky, and which I cannot recommend to you highly enough, the late Father Matthew Baker of blessed memory shows us Father George homing in on the very scriptural way one of his own heroes, Saint Philaret Drozdov, goes about doing theology. He records, as a theologian and a teacher, Philaret was, above all, a biblicist, and one with a lively sense of history. Contrary to the method then commonly employed, Philaret did not consult Holy Scriptures for proofs. He proceeded from the sacred texts. In Bukharev's apt phrase, for Philaret, biblical texts, quote, were the thoughts of the living and all-wise God, emanating from his unknowableness for our understanding, end quote. His thoughts lived in the biblical element. He pondered aloud while sifting the nuances of a biblical story. If we wish to be better theologians, we must become, above all else, better students of the Holy Scriptures, not simply mining it for proof texts or moral exemplars, but reading to know and reading to understand. And this is as true for the layperson as it is for the aspiring clergyman. This task begins simply with becoming more familiar with the contents of both the Old and the New Testaments. It isn't even especially important that we understand everything we're reading at first. Explanations are far easier to come by and far less harmful than something like the Bible for Dummies. Here, an asceticism of the mind, of not allowing our questions or speculations or our boredom, for those of you who aren't especially keen on Leviticus, to prevent us from knowing what the Scriptures say. This asceticism is necessary. Second, we must continually return to the foundational truths elaborated so powerfully in the dogmatic tradition of the Church. How many of us have actually read the texts of the ecumenical councils, or more than just snippets of St. Irenaeus or St. John of Damascus, who, by the way, is masterful in his simplicity of expression? And I encourage all of you, you can find his works online. The exact exposition is very easy to understand, but incredibly thorough and incredibly rich. Though these texts can be challenging, they are honestly not anywhere near as difficult to read as your average theology journal article written in our own language today. Reading the Scriptures and coming to know them in this way helps to, and the dogmatic texts of the Church, helps to preserve the connections between us and our sources. It establishes a bridge between history and theology and our problems and concerns in contemporary culture now. It connects those things together. Doing this preserves the connections between us and our sources so that as we apply them to our modern questions and problems, we do so in a way that is faithful and successful as an act of traditioning the faith once delivered to the saints. I do not suggest that simply repeating dogmatic formula is an adequate response to the problems of our time, but the only authentic way for us to arrive at those answers is through a faithful and serious engagement with the theological reasoning of our tradition. This requires two further comments for the reader or writer of theology. First, we simply need to read more carefully. We've already seen what a little bit of careful reading can yield, and this should become our habit to the degree of our ability. We cannot do this unless we learn to practice the asceticism of the mind I mentioned a moment ago. We must discipline the impulsive reactions of our thoughts as much as we do those of our body. We need to train ourselves in the art of reading to understand rather than reading to react, especially when what we're reading is something we don't like. I am also afraid to say that this will require us to read more deeply and may even require us to use books. Second, third, we need to give a much higher priority to the practice of exegesis. Returning to Father Matthew Baker's article, we read, "For Philaret, theological reasoning finds its home in exegesis." Here, Florovsky's passing comparison of Philaret's theology to that of St. Gregory of Nyssa is perhaps significant. In Gregory's terms, the theologian explicates the train of the biblical narrative in its inner connections, disclosing through them the order of the divine economy itself. Theology, according to Metropolitan Philaret, in its essence and its method, should be a theology of interpretation, a coherent, holistic disclosure of the doctrine of divine revelation. I don't know that I can say it any more thoroughly than that. In the course of my remarks this evening, I have attempted to demonstrate that the way we do theology, particularly online, is susceptible to a series of related problems that hinder us in the task of understanding and articulating our faith theologically. The examples I chose were selected expressly to show that these problems don't belong just to the hoi polloi and their raucous internet forums. They occur at the highest levels of ecclesial and academic repute, which demonstrates their ubiquity. I've also pointed out what I think are the most valuable changes we can make in order to address and overcome these problems. I believe that becoming better students of the Scriptures with better reading habits and habits of mind, more disciplined habits of mind, and a closer, more attentive eye on our dogmatic tradition will help us to deepen our own understanding of Christianity and make us better stewards of it as we seek to express it, to live it, and to hand it down to our own children. In the historical journey of the church, we march through this age toward the age of the kingdom to come, the kingdom of God. There was never a time when this was not a difficult sojourn, but the proclamation of the gospel has not ceased to bear fruit down to this very hour. Let it bear fruit also in us. Thank you for listening.
Father John, thank you very much for your edifying lecture this evening. Thank you to you all, to your eminence, for your presence with us, students and visitors here. For those who are watching at home, thank you for joining us. We thank once again the L.C. Sphere Ganister Foundation for the generous grant, which allows us the camera that's bringing you this live stream this evening and the font for our lecture tonight. We encourage you, if you'd like to read more about Father John Cox and his work, to visit ruleoffaith.org, the online journal of which he is the co-editor. There also, I'm sure you can find his email address if you wish to send him some questions from out in the world. For now, we will thank you all. Let us stand and sing together, and we'll close for the evening. Ever blessed and most pure in the Mother of God, more honorable than the cherubim, and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption thou gavest birth to God the Word, through the veil of